Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to this Future of UK Treescapes seminar. And we'll enable the live transcription. So we've got a great talk today from a couple of people who are part of the branching out team. I just thought I'd go over a couple of the housekeeping rules. So obviously, we do encourage people to keep their cameras on for this if you want to, especially for the questions at the end, because it helps speakers know that they're talking to people. If the speakers are talking and it's kind of not open for questions at that point, then please keep your microphones off. But at the end, when they do invite questions, or if you invite questions throughout, you can either do that by putting your hand up physically on the camera or using the Zoom functionality. Or I will be keeping an eye on the chat as well. So if you wanted to type your questions into the chat, but it is always great if people do unmute for the question portion. That's quite a nice way to have a conversation then. And I think that's it. We are recording the meeting today. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, keep your camera and microphone off, obviously. And I think that's everything. I will hand over to Jasper and Joanne, who are going to start the seminar.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Great. Yeah, so welcome and thanks for showing up for the seminar that Joe and I are presenting. So I'm Professor Jasper Kenter, and I'm associated with Aberystwyth University and the University of York. And I also direct Ecologos Research, which is the entity by which I'm participating in this project, which is a branching out, which is a collaboration between SEI that Joe works for, Loughborough University with PI Mike Wilson, Ecologos, which is my company, Forest Research, and the Open University. And this is our team in the particular work package that's been working on our values framework, which we're going to be talking about today. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself before I continue?
I can say a bit. I'm a research associate at the University of York and particularly at the Stockholm Environment Institute within the Environment and Geography Department at the University of York. And I've had the great privilege of working as a research associate on this project.
Thank you. So we're going to be talking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. So we're in the kind of early stages still of our project, or kind of the early to middle stages of our project, where we've been working and developing a values framework and starting to apply that with end users, and soon we'll be working with citizen panels. And Joe will be talking about that kind of empirical data gathering and the next steps in our kind of deliberative work with citizens. But before that, I will be talking about the value framework itself and the concepts behind it. So where we were coming from really is from a perspective of inclusive decision-making, a perspective of sustainability and justice, which includes both kind of where procedural justice is very important to us. So the Branching Out project looks at the social and cultural values of trees, recognizing that social cultural values are still not considered on a par with economic and ecological values, but also that many social and cultural groups will in particular not have their views, their voices, their values recognized sufficiently in decision making. And that there's a link between which values are recognized and whose values are recognized and how they are recognized. So inclusive decision-making requires that we equally consider all the ways that trees are important by all the people who find them important, and also considering the value of trees in their own right. Yet there's a huge kind of plethora of different kind of values. Abby, could you turn the waiting room off so that everybody can be admitted? Because I'm continually seeing messages about new people coming into the waiting room.
I don't think I can turn it off at this point. It's also Imperial has it set up as a
fair enough.
thing,
Okay.
so I'm sorry.
I'll ignore all the flashing messages.
Yeah, just ignore it. I'm really sorry.
Above my slides as well. No worries. Okay. So with all this, plethora of values and people who might harbor or express these values, there's a kind of real difficulty of how do we do that? How do we recognize these multiple or plural values in decision making and have processes to form shared values that can be integrated in decision making? So we need some kind of way where we can see we can continue to see the woods through the trees. And this is what's behind what we're doing. We are building on work by the Intergovernmental Panel, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which in 2022, just a few months ago, published its values assessment that I was a lead author for. And part of this values assessment is something called the Life Framework, which organizes, categorizes values from across different kinds of disciplines and knowledge systems into 4 basic categories that are related to the way that we consider nature and relate to nature. And these 4 categories applied to trees and treescapes in our branching out project, related to living from trees, where trees are important for wealth and prosperity, where we live in and amongst trees and treescapes, where trees and treescapes shape the place that we live, we work, we recreate. We live with trees, where trees are important spaces for nature. And we also live as trees, where we consider trees in different ways to be a part of us. And I will be talking more about what these frames mean, and Joe will be talking more about how some of the people we've worked with in the deliberative work we've done so far, as well as in our literature review, how kind of trees and treescapes feature and what their values are associated with these 4 different frames to organize values. Now, we can't just have a conceptual framework, we also need a process. So I've mentioned this already a few times, that the process that we're taking within branching out is very much deliberative, is focused on developing shared values, bringing people from different stakeholder interests and citizens from different social cultural groups, both users and non-users of treescapes, people who are familiar with trees professionally or personally, because maybe they walk their dog or go for a run or take their kids into urban tree spaces, or people who have very little access or connection with trees as well. So bringing together people really along that spectrum. And then trying to work and bring together this deliberative process and co-production process with end users with more analytical methods and different sets of data indicators, and seeing if we can, through this kind of integrated method, building on the values framework, find a way to better include social and cultural values in a practical way that delivers impact. So the background to this really is, the last decade, the arising of the ecosystem services framework as becoming increasingly important, and the many different ecosystem services that have been recognized around trees and treescapes, provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural ecosystem services. As you can see from some of these quotes from some of the workshops that we've done so far, we can find aspects of each of these ecosystem services in the values that people relate. And the ecosystem services framework, certainly in the UK, as very rapidly, as I'm sure many of you know, kind of ascended into policy at different scales. And there's a increasing recognition that taking some kind of ecosystem approach where we recognize the multiple ecosystem services that nature provides, and looking at conflicts, trade-offs, and synergies between them is an important way of better recognizing the multiple values of nature. However, as again, we still struggle to do that in terms of the social and cultural values of trees, despite that these ecosystem services are being recognized increasingly. So an example in an urban trees setting is the Happy Man tree in Woodbury Down in London, named after a pub that's not there anymore, but the tree was for a long time after the pub closed. Yet this tree has also been taken down I can't remember, very recently. And people associated many different values with this single individual tree. There are not that many trees in this particular area of London, and this tree was very closely tied up to history and collective cultural connections, as well as personal, individual, emotional connections that people had with the tree. And when we kind of think about trees in this kind of way, and the strong social and cultural values that people can have with trees, it's a question of whether the ecosystem services framework is really able to fully recognize those values. Certainly within the planning system, the values of that particular tree weren't recognized. Maybe they would have if a kind of full ecosystem services approach had been applied. Yet many of these values, like around the Happy Man tree, don't quite fit into this concept. So what are some of the conceptual and practical issues with ecosystem services? Well, it's a very particular concept. Originally kind of comes from economics and linking ecology and economics together in environmental economics. And that conceptualization has influenced the way that we look at ecosystem services. So it's a certain kind of epistemic approach, a stock flow concept, where we think about nature in terms of natural capital, a stock of natural capital that provides a flow of goods and services to people. And when we think of nature in that kind of way, that biases towards certain things, towards instrumentalism, that nature provides benefits to people. So nature is a means to an end for increasing human welfare, and that needs to be kind of measurable in some kind of way as a flow. So not just instrumentalism, but specifically anthropocentrism. So people are central here. It's about benefits to people that nature provides. And in doing so, we think of nature in a dualistic way as well. We have natural capital, and then we have people, and there's a flow between them. So there's a concept of nature as kind of to some degree separate or separable from people, and that relationship, there's an emphasis on the flow of benefit from people to nature. Ecosystem services doesn't tend to talk as much about the movements the other way, the care we have for nature, the responsibilities we feel for nature, or maybe the duties that we experience. So it biases towards a particular way of thinking of the value of nature. And this has been recognized by IPBES in its nature's contributions to people framework that was adopted a couple of years ago. And that to a range of advancements. Firstly, a broader recognition of culture, a recognition that the ecosystem services concept originated in the West, and in the way that and that led to there being particular kind of cultural assumptions that are inherent in those concepts of, for example, of dualism and anthropocentrism, that aren't necessarily recognized across other cultures, but also a recognition more kind of within the system that there's a problem with kind of relegating culture to the notion of a service. Culture is more than a service, and is in a sense a medium in which all ecosystem services are a kind of a flow, as well as that it's a driver of change in ecosystem services itself. So this broader role of culture and the recognition of culture is important for all types of nature's contributions to people, including what we kind of used to call provisioning and regulating services, not just cultural services. That culture plays a role in all of those services or contributions is a really important advancement in the NCP framework. And this kind of also associated with considering more diverse worldviews about what nature is in and of itself. So there's a recognition that we think of nature not just as natural capital, but in many different kinds of ways, and that there can be many different kinds of epistemic assumptions and knowledge systems around the ways that we think of nature and the way that it contributes benefits to people. And those contributions thus are not just to be thought about in generalized categories. So the NCP framework, as many of you know, thinks about material regulating and non-material contributions that kind of are the successors to the ideas of provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. And, you know, within these, we have these kind of set categories that can be important for cross scale and cross geographic comparisons of values and services. So there's there's clearly some real advantages to having some of these generalized categories, but there's also recognition explicitly in the NCP framework that values are localized, and that in local concepts, local contexts, those generalized categories might not be the best approach, and that there are other ways of understanding contributions, nature's contributions to people, context-specific contributions that may not always be comparable against across context because of these diverse worldviews. And finally, there's much more attention to relational values. So the importance of meaningful relationships between people and nature are also a benefit that is less instrumental than the way that ecosystem services frameworks can typically, though increasingly, more relationally already in the cultural ecosystem services sphere. NCP kind of makes that shift to the understanding of nature as a relational source of benefits explicit. Yet, the NCP have also been challenged. Many of these things, the recognition of diverse worldviews, attention to relational values, more contextual understandings, broader recognition of culture, were already being recognized within the kind of ecosystem services movement or field. So is this really a kind of a rebranding exercise, just kind of putting a new name on something which was already happening, but in doing so, perhaps risking having to just introduce something new for the sake of politics rather than kind of genuine kind of theoretical or empirical improvements to what we're doing. I think a more substantive argument is this concern that this approach is still anthropocentric. It's still about contributions to people. It's still thinking in this kind of benefits-based way where people are central, and in doing so excludes extrinsic values. If we're still kind of stuck with some of these downsides, and if this is really kind of a kind of rebranding exercise rather than a genuine kind of conceptual advancement, is that a good idea? Because we've spent so much time on ecosystem services. Why do we want to suddenly start to move to something else just when decision makers are starting to take up this concept of ecosystem services? So I'm not going to go into this debate too much. I'm more kind of highlighting this from the perspective of an evolution, a conceptual evolution that at the same time still brings up some unresolved issues in the debate that we want to kind of move beyond in the branching out values framework based on further advancements in IPBES. So further advancements in IPBES, in the values assessment, thinking about values in diverse ways, in terms of indicators, in terms of specific values of nature and NCP, in terms of broad values, which used to be called transcendental values in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment follow-on, where specific values were also called contextual values in the UK NEA follow-on context, and worldviews, which underpin those broad values. So basic kind of categories of values and values-related concepts which relate to each other in this kind of onion approach. Worldviews underpin broad values influence what specific values are important, and those then translate into indicators, and that's the way they can be integrated into policy. And then the values assessment cuts across these different layers of what we started calling the onion through these four frames: living from nature, living in nature, living with nature, and living as nature. But just kind of going back to these three types of values, what are broad values, also called transcendental values? There are overarching principles and life goals. Specific values are the different ways in which, in our context, trees are important. And value indicators can be both quantitative or qualitative indicators that denote that importance. And then finally, in our approach, but also in IPBES, values can be considered at the individual level, but also as shared values formed through some kind of social process, either a kind of longer term process of socialization, such as the values of a particular community or cultural values, or through a shorter term process of deliberation or other kind of social deliberative group-based process, so forming group values. And then finally, kind of a further differentiation around specific values, differentiated between intrinsic values, the values of natural entities as ends in and of themselves, relational values, which are the values of meaningful, in principle, non-substitutable relationships between people and nature, and instrumental values, which is the values of, in principle, substitutable natural entities as a means to human ends. So instrumental values, means to human ends. Relational values, it's about the relationship between people and nature. Intrinsic values, the value of nature in and of itself, regardless of whether there's reference to people as valuers. And here's a range of kind of key examples that IPBES found across the literature of these different types of values. So again, kind of building on this categorization and trying to find a way to find a wood through the trees, then how do we organize values across all these different categories? So the LIFE framework builds on work originally by John O'Neill and colleagues, and then by myself and Seb O'Connor, who's based in Leeds at the moment, and then flowing into IPBES, categorizing these four frames: living in, living from, living as, and living with nature, across two axes of anthropocentrism and the other axis has dropped out of the picture here. The other axis is between dualism and non-dualism, thinking that fundamentally we can think about values of nature across these two spectra, and these four ways of relating to nature kind of can be situated on that kind of spectrum. So living from nature, nature matters for how the variety of ways it sustains people's lives and the goods and services supporting human needs and prosperity. So really it's about nature as a resource. Living nature is about nature mattering as other than human, including cycles, processes, the flourishing of many other species. Living in nature, nature matters the setting for people's lives and practices, their land and home. So conceived of as things like places, heritage, cultural dimensions for nature, landscapes, land, territory. And then finally, living as nature, where nature matters because it helps constitute us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And we can experience this through relation of oneness, kinship, interdependence, and interpenetration with nature. And what we found in IPBES across the literature is that in the vast thousands of documents that we screened across different fields in environmental studies, living from nature was really the framing that very strongly dominated the literature, including the ecosystem services literature. The other frames far less so, and living as nature was only found in 9% of the literature across fields. We found very few references to other frames. So we found that the kind of screening the literature and coding for different frames, the four kind of frames were really performed quite well in being able to capture all the different kinds of very diverse human nature relationships expressed there within these very broad kind of four framing categories. So much more detail in IPBES that I don't have time to think about, but have a look at the chapter 2 of the IPBES values assessment, where this gets explored in a lot more detail, and this will be published in due course in peer-reviewed papers as well, of course. And then finally, kind of the way that we're thinking about the importance of these frames for decision making is that when we take decisions from the perspective of thinking of nature in terms of one of these frames, we're risking missing out on certain kind of values. So there's some real risks of overemphasizing certain frames and also risk of underemphasizing other frames. And so in this sense, the process of trying to integrate multiple values and multiple human nature relationships into decision-making can be conceived of as a way of including and also balancing between multiple frames. So we found some very strongly kind of transformative aspects of how decision-making could change when more than one or kind of multiple or ideally all four of the frames were considered in decisions. And this kind of inclusivity and justice angle then becomes very important for achieving kind of sustainable development, which again can be conceived of in different kinds of ways according to each of these frames. And again, some other kind of ways that we conceived of the different purposes of this framework, from transforming to organizing, communicating values, designing valuations, assessing values. So it's a kind of very practical approach that these four frames can be used for. And even though they mean to go beyond ecosystem services and NCP, considering intrinsic relational and non-anthropocentric values, as well as anthropocentric ones, dualistic as well as non-dualistic conceptions, ecosystem services and NCP can nonetheless be readily mapped across the frames, and we did that as well in the IPBES assessment, and this is also something that, as you'll see, we're kind of starting to do within branching out. We'll skip that. When we think about this then in the context of the branching out framework, we're starting to apply this to trees, and we've kind of defined them in these ways. So living in treescapes, the ways that urban trees and treescapes shape the place where we live, work, and recreate, living from treescapes, urban trees and treescapes as a resource to live from, living with treescapes, the ways that urban trees and treescapes matter as space for nature, and living as treescapes, the ways that urban trees and treescapes matter as a part of people and ways that people feel part of trees. Very important to note is that these frames can overlap. They're not meant to be hard boundaries, and they're not mutually exclusive. The point of them is not to go through some kind of reductionistic exercise in categorizing all values and human nature relationships, but rather to expand the scope of values that are considered in decision-making. So as you'll see again in a minute, it doesn't matter exactly how we perfectly assign different values to these different frames. It's more that prompting for these different frames and letting the people who we ask to value things, as well as decision makers, think about nature in these four ways can help to expand the scope of values that get elicited. And so we're implementing this by co-producing indicators for each of these four frames through participatory research with end users. And in this, I'm handing over to Jo.
Thanks, Jasper. So I'm going to talk a bit through what we've now done to put the framework into practice for the Branching Out project. Next. So we've, first I'll just talk about the process and then a bit about the first data that we've got from our first interactions with the end user panel. So we're using a deliberative process focused on mobilizing the social and cultural values of urban treescapes in our three focus cities. That's York, Milton Keynes, and Cardiff. What I mean by this is that, as Jasper said, social and cultural values are specific for individuals or groups, they're context specific. And so we want to draw on the people from our three focal cities to co-produce the values that are important for their city, and then work with them to discover and identify indicators that are relevant and feasible for them to measure that will inclusively and realistically represent the values of their trees. We're using story to identify the values, both or all together in the past, in the present, and in the future. to understand how the people of those 3 cities value their trees. So for the stories of the past, we, or another part of the project, have collected a fantastic collection of folk stories and historical tales that involve trees, from which we can draw how trees have been valued over time. We're now co-producing stories of the present and will be co-producing stories of the future with our panels of citizens and our panels of end users, and those are the people who are making decisions about urban trees. We're working with them around the framework and with the stories that they share with us to collect the values, and using those values, we'll start to think about how we can measure them. What is measurable about them? What is a representative value? And what measures the presence of a value? What measures the quality of a value? We've done a literature review on how people have measured the social and cultural values of trees in urban areas across the globe. And we've come to the conclusion that values represented in the literature very often aren't that good as indicators of the quality of the values that people hold, much less why, which frame one would put those values in. So, for example, measuring the number of people visiting an urban park indicates that people use the park, but not why they are there and whether they got everything they wanted from the park. Unless we run regular questionnaires, and that is costly. Visiting a park could satisfy a significant, or the indicator of visiting a park could satisfy many different values. So in one sense, it is a sweeping indicator that covers a lot of bases, but at the same time, it doesn't tell us enough about which values may not be provided to people. Having said that, a few values like heritage values are quite well understood, so we mustn't forget that. Then we've got urban tree observatories, which will feed into how we connect those values that we've collected to the treescape characteristics, treescape being the trees and the green spaces across the city. And the urban tree observatories are sites set up where citizen scientists are collecting intensive data on trees in the focal cities using the Treezilla tree monitoring and recording app. Anybody can do that, by the way. We've got a link at the end if you want to go out and add your local trees to the app. And altogether, this will inform new ways to map social and cultural value. Very few cities have detailed mapping of their urban trees, and that hampers the strategic decision-making. And our end goal is to provide tools for decision-making in a form that the end user panels will agree that it is useful. Next, please. So we've held our first round of end user panels, and we asked them about their own personal relationships with trees. We asked about the kind of values and associations that they hold, and also the values and associations that they came across and have come across in the course of their roles. And over the next few slides, I'll show that there is a lot of commonality in the values that came up in each of our focal cities. And the values that they raised reflected and added to what we found in the literature, and reflecting afterwards on the interaction with them and how we got them to work with the framework. I'll say a bit later on about how they found it both a useful approach, but still convoluted. So we've got a bit of work still to make it a straightforward thing to use and put into practice. Next, please. So the next few slides I want to show what the panel members contributed. So just to make it clear that these values have been put into the frames by the panel members, not by us. We asked them before we met them in a pre-workshop questionnaire about their personal relationship, to tell us about their personal relationship with trees, and to think about those relationships from each of the 4 perspectives of the life framework. And so this is how they told us about how they relate to trees, but it does closely match how we translated the IPBES conceptualization of the frames for urban trees and treescapes. So in the living in frame, the sort of values coming up show very much how trees provide a focus for connecting us to the place, for making a desirable setting that we, people choose to set to live and to work in places with trees, because it provides a nice backdrop in which to live our lives. It also shows how people see trees as defining, at least in part, a city's identity and character. But there are also physical and mental well-being values here. Mental well-being in relief, respite that seeing greenery gives us, and this has been shown in various studies. Greenery relieves our eyes and our stress levels, but also physical well-being in the space. Trees and green spaces provide a setting in which we can exercise, play, do other outdoor activities. And one of the quotes at the beginning put it nicely, that trees soften the harshness of man-made landscapes. That was someone from Milton Keynes. Next, please. So looking at trees as resources, we recognize the economic environmental resources here: timber, wood, fuel, fruit, other uses of wood and sticks in gardens or whatever. And the ecosystem service of trees cleaning the air for us. But also mentioned here is the aesthetic beauty of trees. So particularly when we value the aesthetics of a place for attracting tourists, for example. And aesthetics is perhaps the most common cultural value that we know from the ecosystem services framework. There's also mental health mentioned here, and the ways in which treescapes provide a focus for communities coming together. So this is seeing trees as a resource for bringing communities together, for the mental health, it's about how the trees themselves, how we take mental health from the trees in a way. So it's a slightly different way of valuing the trees than in the living in framework, where the trees make the setting. Okay, next, please. So in the living with frame, for us, that's about valuing trees for the space that they provide for nature. And indeed, this comes through in the broad consensus from members valuing it as a habitat for wildlife. And so they value the trees because they provide a habitat for wildlife and other plants and birds and insects. Also, there's mention of supporting services, but also there's a connection to nature. So panel members value the space that trees provide for nature because it allows us to connect to nature. And in cities, this is especially important. Next, please. So in the living as frame, there's a lot about personal connections to trees, as we might expect. And there's in different shapes. So specific connections we have with individual trees or with treescapes, memories, personal stories that are evoked. And other values are similar. It's elusive, intrinsic feeling of awe and wonder that being among trees gives us. And these illustrate one of the established drivers of well-being benefits from nature. It's transcendence, the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself that puts your own life into perspective. Valuing trees in this way has a reinforcing effect on well-being benefits, on other well-being benefits. But it requires a kind of tree literacy to allow us to access those benefits. So we need to know about how great it is to go for woodland walks and parks and feel comfortable to venture out into them as much as physically having access to them. And this is something that starts in childhood. So without having contact to trees early on and to green spaces, for example, in inner cities, those benefits are less accessible. We forget how to interact with nature. Next, please. And as well as all of those positives, there are also negatives. So there's a kind of flip side to each one of the frames. And we can't neglect these negative aspects. We need to address the fact that trees are not a positive thing for everyone in every respect. Safety concerns and maintenance are commonly costed into evaluations. And it's not only new developments taking out urban trees, it's private homeowners take out, and local authorities have no control, or much less control over that, really. Also, for some, trees and woods are something to be wary of, to be scared of, and we need to find a way to work with these negative aspects, work them into how we operationalize the framework. Next, please. And probably, okay, almost next. I'd also like to bring all of this together just to point out that a couple values appear in multiple frames. And I think this illustrates really nicely why we need to, why the framework is so useful for asking people why they have a particular value, not just what values they hold. And so it shows how the life framework unpacks social and cultural value, but also, as Jasper was mentioning, this social nature of value, how cultural services are not a service, but they're more like a setting in which all of the other economic and environmental values manifest. And so, yeah, people hold all of their values for a particular reason, and two people might hold the same value for different reasons. And if they are in charge of policy making, it can make the policy look quite different. So next, for example, providing habitat for wildlife. In living with, we expect that, because we expect to see trees providing valued for the space that they provide, that they create for nature. But it's also in living in. And there it's about valuing the trees because they make the setting, the backdrop, more desirable, because they attract animals, birds and insects. It's quite similar, but there is a difference in why those trees are valued, and that's why it goes across the two frames. Next, please. So marking time is another one. It often appears in the living in because it's part of the setting. It's, you know, people like the setting of having changing trees because it makes giant clocks out of our surroundings. We can look out of our window and see that it's autumn or winter. But also it appeared in the living as, and I got a sense that that was closer to being grounded, so that the trees and in their function of marking time for that person, it was grounding them into their place in the grander scheme of things, and also highlighting how our time scale is different to that of trees. So although they mark the change of the seasons, they also, in a way, especially for the older trees, the ancient trees, those trees remain unchanging, whereas we trundle along. And so it really gives a sense of those trees witnessing the passing of the years and watching over us. So it's quite a different reason. And then finally, next, physical and mental well-being cuts across a couple of the themes. And so in living in, it's very much about how trees make the outdoors a good place to go to improve our health. In living from, it's, as I mentioned, it's about the trees, how the trees themselves support us. And then in living as, I was really excited to see a bit of what Jasper mentioned about how the trees and our relationship to the trees stimulate our emotional and mental development. And that is, you know, really reaching us on a much more personal level. So there's a lot here, and we can see how values really spread across the frameworks, and how those different frames show us how to view trees in different ways. And see how the social and cultural values are intermingled with economic and environmental values. And what really stands out for me is how social and cultural values are a mechanism through which other benefits can be accrued. I think we're running over time, so I'll try and rush the next bits. Next, please. So, and yeah, okay. So we established with that, the last few slides, we established a great set of values using a grounded approach, started with nothing and just see what the panel gave us and how it populates the 4 frames. But we also want to provide a tool for decision makers. So we want a more structured way to elicit social and cultural values. So these on the screen there are the 9 themes. From the literature review, we can sort of group all of the values that came up and the indicators into these 9 broad themes. And then to match that, or to put it in the structure of the framework, if you click again, you can then put it to the 4 frames, because as we've seen, you can look at each of those themes in each of those frames. But if you click one more time, you'll soon see that you can actually, we can find a reason. You can find a way that somebody has valued a tree in each theme and in each frame. And when you consider that each theme incorporates multiple values and each of those could have multiple ways of indicating them, this just explodes into a huge number of potential values and indicators. And so most of the panel members, we presented this to them and they worked through. And they agreed that this, presenting this as the way that we, as our tool, is unwieldy and even off-putting for some decision makers, because they might then think they have to collect every value on here, collect data on every value, and that's just not feasible. On the other hand, some appreciated seeing this full range, because they could then see, as Jasper said, it prompts you to think and to see just what is out there, how other people might value trees. And so it opens our mind and might be a catalyst for looking in new directions. So this is really our challenge now that we're going forward, is how to improve our straightforward approach. How do we restructure this so that it's accessible but meets the needs of different end users. So next, please. And so one of the conclusions is we need to restructure it, and we're going to try a differentiated approach. Also, if we think back to those values, as well as having a commonality across the values, there was also quite a lot of difference. And a lot of that difference was around the ways in which trees are governed in each of those cities and the kind of context in which the people who are managing trees are operating. We're in a time of austerity, and I've mentioned it a bit. Councils are under a huge amount of pressure. They've got very low resources, so they're really looking for 1 or 2 key things that they can feasibly do. And so in some of our cities, there's an increasing role for publics to take on the management and decision-making power around trees, and maybe monitoring as well. So what we're trying to do now is work out a differentiated approach that can work for different end users, for different decision makers. So it's flexible, but also accessible by and can work in the different kind of governance arrangements and be applicable to those who have the capacity to engage. So we'll run our first citizen panels in the new year, and as we grow the data set of the values held in each city, we'll also try to work on appropriate indicators that can really link those values to characteristics of trees, so that it's possible to map them across the city, not just here and there where we've got qualitative data from surveys, for example. And also to try and come up with indicators that are representative but feasible. We need to be pragmatic. What is possible to collect, and what is within that constraint, what is the most useful way of representing values. We also need to think beyond trees, and one of the things we mentioned before was needing to take account of negative aspects. We also need to take account of those competing priorities, thinking beyond trees. This framework is all about the value of trees. We also need to think how to integrate that into how those competing priorities are valued. Okay. I think that's almost the end next, and probably skip to the next one. And so just to remind you, after everything we've said, we've told you a bit about the values, about what values are, how they can be conceptualized, and where our branching out values framework come from. It comes from that globally adapted framework, IPBES framework, and it offers a way to comprehensively link our values to the way in which we relate to nature, and in our case, urban trees. And in doing so, the LIFE framework and the branching out values framework for urban trees puts social and cultural values on par with economic and ecological values of trees, and hopefully will contribute to more inclusive decision-making. And our next steps in the project will be to collect more values from the citizen panels, to work on linking values to characteristics of treescapes, and to select key indicators, and take that back to the end user and citizen panels, and hopefully feed into mapping some of these. And we'll work on a differentiated user guide to how to put this into practice in other cities. So that's all from me. I think there's one last slide Jasper wants to speak to.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Jo. So yeah, the big challenge of kind of whittling all that down, that matrix of 9 times 4, you know, how do we get that in 10, 15 indicators in an inclusive and participatory way to represent everything? So that's a big challenge. Just wanted to plug in a kind of very complementary project funded by NERC under the Biodiversity Economics program, which has just started. It's called Navigate. And whereas branching out is focused on social and cultural values, not really thinking about economic approaches that much, although we have some elements of economics. Navigate is looking at how do we integrate multiple values specifically into economics itself, so that economics can move beyond its kind of very strong kind of individualist, instrumentalist bias. And all the case studies are also going to be around woodlands. And we're having a first in-person national stakeholder workshop on January 23 in London. So get in touch with me if you're interested in that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for listening.
Okay, thank you both for that great presentation. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to put up on your cameras now as well for the chat part. It does help people feel a bit more engaged. So if anyone's got any questions, please raise your hand or type them out in the chat, and our lovely speakers will answer them for you. I can't see any hands up. Dee, do you have a question?
Hi, thanks so much for that. It was really, really fascinating to hear what you're doing. Just a question about the 2 panels, the user and the citizen. Differentiate those 2 groups.
I didn't quite catch that. So asking how we differentiate between the citizen panels and the end user panels.
Yeah.
So
and your process of recruiting to those. What sort of numbers are you working with here to sort of do this representative, deliberative, whatever, you know?
So the end user panels, Alison, you can add in if I miss anything out, but the end user panels are people who make decisions about trees. So that was targeted recruitment. We handled that recruitment. We contacted councils. We contacted people with significant portions of land. So the universities, for example, have got large estates. And we tried to contact, for example, developers who manage large tracts of land, but also friends of groups, because in a way they also hold decision-making power over the parks that they have custodianship over. So we tried to be a bit broad in who we classed as decision makers over trees. And that gave a really interesting mix of discussion at those panel workshops. Then the citizen panel, we've asked a company to recruit that, and so that is we're trying to get it as a representative mix of just general people. And so they might be tree lovers and they might not. Yeah.
Okay, great. Are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, Jasper has said that he will share the slides. Jasper, if you share them with me, then I can just email them directly out to everyone if you're happy to do that. Thanks. Any more questions from the audience? Going once. Okay, great. I think it was a really great and informative talk, and possibly you answered everyone's questions during it as well, because it was so in depth. So yes, I just want to say very much thank you for that. As everybody's hopefully seen in the chat, I will be sharing the recording as soon as it's available on YouTube, and feel free to share it beyond that with your networks as well. That's always great. And we hope you found this talk really, really useful. Thank you, Joanne and Jasper.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks.
Yeah, and feel free to email if you do end up having any other questions or want to get in touch.